When I first started in motor racing many years ago, social media didn't even exist, and now it's an integral part of all of our daily lives. And it means that you at home can communicate with us here at Formula One's Media and Technology Centre, and all season you've been doing exactly that. Well, I thought I'd pick up on a few of the questions that have come in during and in the wake of the Sakhir Grand Prix just 1 week ago. And one question an awful lot of you asked us about was the rear wing on Sergio Perez's race-winning Racing Point car. And as you can see here, it was a completely different design to the rear wing they used at the Bahrain Grand Prix, held a week earlier on roughly the same circuit. Well, the same circuit, but a different layout. And you can see the Sakhir Grand Prix rear wing is a much more bold section, and overall a smaller rear wing in general, so there's less wing attacking the wind that's coming at the car. That means it's a lower downforce specification, but also less drag on the car. That allows it to go down the straights a lot better, but the standard straight lower section rear wing you saw for Bahrain on Perez's car, that allowed it to get more grip and more performance in corners. And that makes a really big difference all the way around the lap. And it's worth looking at the difference those two aerodynamic setups make at the Sakhir Grand Prix compared to the Bahrain Grand Prix. Now, normally when we're looking at two driver comparisons, you have two different faces on the screen. But as you can see here, we have Sergio Perez versus Sergio Perez. But Sergio Perez in Bahrain specification versus Sergio Perez in Sakhir specification, the outer circuit layout for that Racing Point car. And let's not forget, and this is a really important thing to note, in Bahrain, Sergio Perez blew up the engine on that Racing Point car. So the team had to fit an older engine into the back of his car for the Sakhir Grand Prix. Now that engine had lifed out, and actually he's had to replace it ahead of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix because it was completely finished. So that old nail of an engine essentially, the Mercedes V6, they've shown great reliability in normal situations, but it's coming to the end of its life. You couldn't push it that hard. The high-speed nature of the Sakhir Grand Prix, you don't want an engine that doesn't work very well. You have to be a bit gentle to it. But what I thought we'd take a look at was Sergio Perez's fastest laps in qualifying from both Bahrain and Sakhir. And it's really revealing to take a look at the different performance the two setups have. On the right-hand side, Sakhir Grand Prix with that bowl-shaped rear wing. He's setting a much faster speed down the start-finish straight to start his lap here, already gaining on Sergio Perez in Bahrain specification. Look at that, almost a tenth of a second, getting back to 0.2 of a second just on the start-finish straight. Much higher speed from Sergio Perez in Sakhir. But look, as he goes through the slightly twisty first sector, Sergio Perez in Bahrain is coming back at Sergio Perez in Sakhir. But as soon as they get onto the straight, that low drag rear wing has its impact, and even with that low performance or lower performance V6 in the back of his car, that old engine, Sergio Perez in Sakhir specification was still much quicker down the straights than Sergio Perez in Bahrain specification, and that's why Sergio Perez was quicker than Sergio Perez with that different aerodynamic performance. Another question that came in on hashtag F1 Live during the Sakhir Grand Prix weekend was a slightly interesting one, and there are a few related questions around it. But the question was, do Formula One cars have vehicle identification numbers, like a road car, VIN numbers, as you say tautologically? Those are the long numbers that usually start WWWZZZ, that is actually your road car's chassis number. Well, Formula One cars don't exactly have that, but they do have chassis numbers. So Racing Point will have built about 5 or 6 cars this season, and each one will be RP20 number 1, RP20 number 2, RP20 number 3, and so on. Typically, there is a subtle difference between each of those chassis as well. Chassis 1, the first one made, is quite often the heaviest one made before the guys who are making it find a few little shortcuts, a few ways to improve the design. It's also usually the least stiff of the monocoques. The chassis get slightly better as they build them through the run of production, finding those little ways to make things ever so slightly better each time. That improves the torsional rigidity of the car, the stiffness of it, and sometimes saves a little bit of weight as well. But the question is also coming in, how many cars does each team build? Of course, they have 2 cars in each race and usually a spare tub in the box somewhere in the back of the garage. In reality, every team usually has a few more cars than that. Back in the days when there was open testing, each team used to build up to 9 or 10 chassis for 2 drivers and all of the races. But now with limited testing, you might see maybe a smaller team like Williams building as many as 4 chassis, 2 race cars, 1 spare and 1 extra spare back at the factory. Bigger teams like Mercedes, well, I'm told they build 6 chassis per year. Moving forwards though, the teams have got to be a little bit careful how they use their chassis, because some of these monocoques could be used in the 2021 season. With the homologation regulations as they are, it means a lot of the chassis will be completely usable next year. And if you're a smaller team that's strapped for budget, you could save a little bit of money, save a little bit of time by keeping a 2020 monocoque and using it in 2021. The design is pretty much the same. However, as a monocoque gets older, it loses a little bit of performance. You lose a little bit of that stiffness and it just isn't quite as good. So maybe everybody's going to build a new tub using the old tooling. Certainly the big teams, Ferrari, Mercedes, Red Bull, they'll all build completely new chassis for next season. But will the smaller teams? It's up to them and probably up to their bean counters. And the last question I wanted to address on hashtag F1 Live from the Sakhir Grand Prix was something that seems quite obvious to people who know, but maybe not so obvious to people who don't. What's the funny light on the roll hoop of every Formula One car? Well, you can see what I'm talking about here on George Russell's Mercedes on the starting grid at the Sakhir Grand Prix. That green light just sitting there below the TV camera housing. That green light is the ERS status light. Energy Recovery System status light. So it tells you what's going on in that hybrid system. The Energy Recovery System, of course, better known as the hybrid system. So is it safe to touch the car? Are the motors all working properly? And on the starting grid, yeah, of course they are. And you can see the Mercedes mechanics here. No special gloves, no special protection. The car's completely in its safe state. But that's not always the case, because sometimes the ERS systems on various cars go wrong. And that's exactly what happened to George Russell in free practice at Abu Dhabi. George Russell's car came into the pits with what looked like, and the team think, was an MGU-K, motor generator unit kinetic failure. That's one of the big electric motors on the car. So they started pushing the car back into the garage as normal, but look on the roll hoop, the light is flashing bright red. That means danger. Don't touch the car, I'm not in a safe state. And as soon as the mechanic at the front noticed that light, all the mechanics were immediately told, let go of the car. And you can see them putting on these yellow gloves. They look like washing up gloves, but they're actually what we call KERS marigolds, Kinetic Energy Recovery System marigolds. And they insulate the mechanics who are touching the car from getting a major electrical shock off the back of it. It did seem that there was a major failure on Russell's car, and that's why they had to be safe. This is what the light should normally look like as a car comes into the pits. Purple, that's its pit lane speed limit. You know, I'm a running racing car, I've got a high voltage system. Have a bit of caution, but I'm meant to be like this. The purple light, which used to be amber, they switched it at some point this season. I'm not entirely sure when, but there was a technical directive that told all of the teams to switch these ERS status lights to purple for this sort of pit lane running. That's what it should look like. And if in case you're wondering about the housings, you can see it again here for George Russell. Every single team uses an identical part for this, and they're manufactured by a small company in Suffolk, England. Even in a crash, those lights are supposed to work for up to 30 seconds after the engine and power unit's been switched off. It's a real safety feature for the car, and something that I think is really important for Formula One going forwards. If you've got any more questions, then keep them coming all the way through the close season and into 2021 on hashtag F1 Live. We do look at all of your questions, and hopefully we'll have lots to talk about in the new year.